interview with you, which I was so excited about.
Thank you so much. And Alex, how old are you?
I'm 26. 26. But I got some family out here as well. I've been leading the Youth Caucus for a while here, especially in Paris and France. And it's been really rewarding to work with people who, who are motivated enough to be involved even from, from being geographically challenged, we'll put it that way.
Yeah. Well, it's like I said, in some ways, you have a better view of America.
Yeah.
When it's like with people, you can't really know yourself outside the relationship with other people.
Yeah.
And you can't really know America's place in the world when you've not left America. I mean, it's a huge blind spot, obviously, exploited tremendously by who.
Right. All right, I'm going to start.
Okay. Thank you, guys. Enjoy. Let's have fun.
Yeah, let's have fun. Thank you so much. Yeah. All right, start rolling in here. We'll get started in a minute here. Hey, thanks for joining. We'll get started shortly. Just to remind everyone, if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box that can be located at the bottom of your Zoom window. I think we'll just get started. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Alex Rubinder. I live in Paris, France, and I'm part of the Democrats Abroad Youth Caucus Steering Committee. We're delighted to welcome Marianne Williamson, a best-selling author, political activist, and spiritual thought leader. As you may remember, Marianne was also a presidential candidate during the 2020 primaries, Democratic primaries, that is. She ran on a platform that advocated for the Green New Deal, reparations for slavery, tax reform, universal health care, and a federal $15 an hour minimum wage. Her social media presence has really resonated with young activists across the US to secure political allies that seek to treat systemic issues rather than just focus on the symptoms.
And Alex, do you want to introduce yourself too?
Was that for me?
No.
Or sorry, Alex, do you want to, and then we'll jump in. Well, okay, so my name is Quinn. I'm co-hosting with Alex, who you just heard from. I am joining you from Bogota. I'm the chair of DA Colombia, and I'm also a member of the DA Global Youth Caucus and the up-and-coming AAPI caucus, which will be released very soon. And I'm super excited to have Marianne with us today. So yes, Marianne, we'll let you take it away.
Well, actually, I think the best thing, given the very chaotic and dramatic situation in the world, I think the best thing would be if we started as a conversation. You throwing questions at me, throwing the kind of topics and discussion that you'd like to have. I think that would actually be better for me.
Great. Well, thank you. We have so many questions. And for those of you who are just joining us, Alex mentioned at the beginning of the call that you can add your questions into the Q&A, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. So the first question we wanted to ask is, you recently tweeted that we should have a Department of Children and Youth. So what we want to understand is what would be the main purpose of this department, and then what would be the goals that you would like to see achieved?
I'm so glad that you mentioned that, Quinn, because it was very much a pillar of my campaign. We have millions of traumatized, chronically traumatized children in the United States. We have 13 million hungry children. And by the way, all of these statistics are before the chaos of the coronavirus. And some of these statistics, I assume, will even be worse in the upcoming months and years. 13 million hungry children, millions of American children who go to school in classrooms that do not even have the adequate school supplies with which to teach a child to read. And if a child cannot learn to read by the age of 8, then statistically that child has a vastly diminished chance of graduating from high school and a vastly increased chance of future incarceration. Something that is very common. Even you and I were discussing Iowa. This was even true, yes, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I remember someone telling me, in public schools throughout America, it is very common that there are trauma rooms. This is how awful it is for millions and millions of American children, many of whom live in what's called America's domestic war zones, where psychologists tell us that their PTSD, 40% of the girls, for instance, in Chicago public schools are deemed to have clinically diagnosed PTSD that is no less severe than that of a veteran coming from Afghanistan or Iraq. Now, these children are not a constituency. They're not old enough to vote, and they're not old enough to work, so they don't have any financial leverage, and therefore they are among the invisible Americans. And we have a political establishment, for the most part, does not cater to them in one way or the other. Now, if you saw that tweet of mine, and I'm glad that you did, I don't know if you saw the YouTube video that was part of it, where there is a woman working with the prison system in the United States, and it's a very interesting video about how much of the population in the U.S. prison system represents people who were traumatized, chronically and severely traumatized as children. So my point with the Department of Children and Youth is that if we don't do something now, this is going to be such an overwhelming problem 20 years from now. And I'm glad that I ran on it, and I continue to speak about it, and I hope the idea will get more traction in the years to come. As you were saying, we can't just continue to treat symptoms. We have got to treat some root causes. We talk about the difficulty, we talk about the racial disparity in our criminal justice system, but the racial disparity in our criminal justice system goes back to the racial disparity that is based in economic disparity among people of color, et cetera. And you're seeing that, of course, play out during this pandemic as well, with such a higher rate of infection among African Americans. There are so many ways that the pandemic is showing America's underbelly. Many of these things that are exploding into catastrophes, really, during the pandemic were already there before the pandemic, but there was more of an ability for the average American to distract ourselves and pretend that things were actually better than they are. We were skating on very thin ice, obviously, when it comes to this pandemic. 37 out of 47 pandemic centers had been closed. There's a wonderful book, someone that you might want to have on as part of your programming at some point. The man's name is Michael Lewis, and he wrote a book called The Fifth Risk. And this book was written before the COVID-19 chaos, but it outlines a problem that very much is in evidence with the coronavirus crisis. And that is how over the last few years, but particularly with this administration, there has been such a withdrawal of investment in anything that supports the public good, much less the public good if, God forbid, there's a collective catastrophe such as there is now. And to add to that, when I pointed out that in this situation, that withdrawal of resources in the public good is very much in evidence. But to be honest, it could just as easily have been a nuclear catastrophe. It could just as easily have been a weather catastrophe, because we're skating on thin ice just as much in those areas as in this one.
Mm-hmm. And I know that was a huge part of your campaign, is tackling these root causes. So I want to kind of combine that with my next question, because you are a leader that people look up to, and in times of crises, people are wondering, yes, we need to tackle those things, but what can we do right now? What do you think we need to be doing right now that maybe that can address these issues, but at the same time be tackling these other things that you said we need for 20 years down the road for the future?
One of the formulas for transformation in politics that is always very meaningful and fundamental to me is the work of Mahatma Gandhi. And Gandhi would say two things, and of course Martin Luther King, who studied those principles in India and brought them back to the United States for application to the struggle for civil rights in the United States in the 1960s. Two things would be factors in answer to your question. First of all is spiritual, self-purification, we would call it. And second of all is political, has to do with education. So I want to take the second one first. We have, I can't remember, it's 9 or 11 states in the United States that do not even require half a year of education in civics or American history or government. This is particularly dangerous because if you're not taught what the Bill of Rights is when you're a child, you don't know to be horrified as an adult when they're under direct assault. So too many Americans don't even remember that there are 3 co-equal branches of government. This is a set up for fascism. And if that's not, and that's clear to any conscious observer at this point. People who don't know what their rights are easy targets for taking those rights away. Particularly what I would think of as the radicalism of the American Revolution, the radicalism of the American ideal. So because of the lack of education among many regarding American history and civics, but also regarding a society whose pop culture has become so superficial over the last few decades, there is so much distraction. So now people are waking up. I don't think the problem is that people aren't woken up. People are like, whoa, 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 I assumed we'd be safe in a situation like this. Well, people don't need to be reminded now, you sure as hell we're not safe. Our economic system, our healthcare system, and our governmental system were not in any way set up to protect and guarantee the safety of the public and the common good if such a thing like this were to have happened. So I think a lot of people need to read some books. A lot of people need to be reading, and a lot of the reading and educating ourselves that we have to do, I think also people are awakening to the fact that since the 1990s, so much of mainstream media is the corporatized version of what a corporatist establishment wants you to hear. So I think this is a good time to be at home because you have a lot to read, a lot to think about, because I think a lot of people are recognizing now, oh my God, I at least indirectly contributed to this. If nothing else than by my assuming someone else would handle it. That's not how, in a Western democracy, citizens can afford to view their responsibility. Citizen activism, I think that's what all of us are awakening to, is that politics is a collective responsibility of every single citizen. The word comes from the Latin root. It doesn't mean of the government, it means of the people. Now, the other issue is what Gandhi talked about as self-purification that he said precedes political activism. And that, of course, has to do with his famous line, we must be the change. It is very tempting right now to be furious. It is very tempting right now to be so angry. But you know, Alex is living in Paris. We want the Indian Revolution. We don't want the French Revolution. We want a nonviolent, peaceful, and anybody who thinks that we can start taking out the guillotines and that's the way to go is very, very naive about what reaction would occur on the part of the system. So the transforming our own emotions is an important part of this. And through prayer, through meditation, through spiritual practice, through reading Gandhi, through reading Dr. King, as Gandhi said, the end is inherent in the means. Many people were used to hearing, well, the end justifies the means. Gandhi said the end is inherent in the means. And once again, Alex being in France, Robespierre was a perfect example. He was a great crusader against the death penalty, right? So these things can turn. An angry generation will not bring peace to the world. So the whole Martin Luther King versus Malcolm X conversation, these things are all back. And this is a perfect time for all of us to be reading, to be thinking, to be praying, to be meditating, Martin Luther King said we need external changes in our circumstances as well as internal changes in our souls. And I think the real holistic activist for the 21st century, which is what absolutely must happen. We need an integrative politics, just like we have an integrative health model now, recognizes we have to look within and without for the kind of changes needed.
Thank you. That's very uplifting. I'm going to pass it off to Alex for the next couple of questions.
Great. First off, I mean, you have, these global prayers and often some reflection videos, and particularly about the coronavirus pandemic. You discussed a prolonged adolescence, in quotations, that, you think a disproportion of people experience. How do you think that this overt crisis, like coronavirus, is going to affect maturity on the population at large? Or
Well,
how can we, in a broader sense, how can we see better transitions from youth to adulthood?
what happens when it comes to coming of age? If you look at indigenous cultures, or you look at something like the Jewish bar mitzvah,
Yeah.
In Judaism, the fact that there is a marking from childhood to adulthood, the Jews have survived for thousands of years, and they would not have survived, given all the patterns of persecution against them. They would not have survived had boys not become men. And now we're living at a time where not only do boys need to become men, girls need to become real women. And this is what happens at adolescence. If you do not consciously mark through such as the indigenous cultures and their ceremonies, religions like the Jews, if you do not consciously mark the movement of adolescence into adulthood, then a person will subconsciously mark. For instance, the tattoos, the body piercing, the sex. In my generation, it had a lot to do with the sexual revolution. It had a lot to do with, but also we also did have a coming of age experience, which was the Vietnam War. That was in my generation. In my parents' generation, they had a coming of age experience, which had to do with World War II. After my generation, there wasn't much to cut your teeth on. Well, people's teeth are cut now. People such as yourself, even though you're not adolescent anymore, you will be forever marked by this experience, and so will everyone at whatever age. So I think when I mentioned a few minutes ago that there's an awakening going on, there's a maturation going on. Nobody's coming out of this situation stuck in an infantilization that allowed them to be women acting like girls and men acting like boys. I think whoever you are, there are very few people whose world is not being rocked by what's happening now. Very few people who are not being challenged, but in their own way receiving the invitation to think much deeper than they had thought before.
Yeah, no, well said. And another question, many young people, including myself, are looking for the best way to create like lasting cultural change. And I've been advising many of our members to kind of get involved in local, state, or congressional campaigns that best reflect their interests. And so, we have these elections coming up in November, and your experience during the progressive political era of the 60s and 70s, do you have any kind of particular recommendations for the youth to get active and maybe,
Yes, I have on my site, Marianne2020.com. I do have a list of progressive candidates that I recommend, who I recommend in terms of state offices, local offices. I think the most important thing is we're in danger. Our democracy is in danger. And if we have another term of Donald Trump, another term of the Republicans in charge of the Senate, if God forbid those were to happen and we were to lose the House, I don't think that the issue is so much telling anybody what to do as it is reminding each other, do something. Mm-hmm. This is as dangerous a moment for our democracy, I believe, as there has ever been in our history.
How did you choose the list of people that you endorsed on your website?
There is a man named Howie Klein, and he's a political mentor of mine. He has a blog called Down with Tyranny.
Okay.
And he's a strong progressive, and I always admire. He's a little far. He goes out there. He's a little crude, a little blunt, more than I would be. But I very much admire his political sensibilities. So I met him quite a while ago, and like I said, he's my mentor. So when it comes to looking at candidates, he's my guy. What do you think, Howie? What do you think of this one, Howie? I've learned a lot from him, and he's really my advisor on this.
Yeah, I'd love to hear how he chooses them.
Yeah, well, check out Down with Tyranny.
I'll check it out. Yeah.
And Howie Klein, and you'll know it's far left stuff.
Great. Yeah. Quinn, you want to ask some of the audience questions? Yeah. The Q&A box. Yeah. Again, if you have any,
I want to ask one, and I know you addressed this a little bit, that we shouldn't really be telling people what to do, but Pauline Manos is wondering, but how can we re-engage people who are disengaged right now, who are apathetic, and both in the US and abroad? Because you do speak about spending a significant time abroad, of having family abroad. So what would you recommend?
You know, it's very in these days to put down social media, but right now, thank God we have it. The internet is the only real opportunity that we have for diversification of opinion, diversification of news, diversification of information, as opposed to the strict corporatist agenda that so dominates our mainstream media. If you have a Facebook page, you have a platform. If you have a Twitter account, you have a platform. If you have an Instagram account, you have a platform. And I think for people living abroad, too many Americans have not traveled abroad. Too many Americans really do not know how other countries see us. Particularly now with all the conversation about socialism, I mean, give me a break. So I think people living abroad informing Americans how ill-informed they are about socialism, about social democracy, about how other countries do it. You know, we have a big, big ocean on our left and a big, big ocean on our right. And until pretty recently, that protected us. It doesn't protect you from anything anymore. Those planes could get here in 6 minutes. But the American consciousness has not expanded to recognize the unity, not just in a spiritual or a moral sense, but in a very real sense in terms of our safety and our security. The coronavirus is a perfect example. So the undereducation and lack of education on the part of the average American regarding the rest of the world, much less America's relationship with the rest of the world, is quite frightening. And as we know, our current president has very much taken advantage of this. So you need to counter that. You need to counter that. Most people so many Americans are just not stupid. We're not stupid people. We're not unintelligent people. But there is a real dearth of information, and people like yourselves can give out that information in ways that are very meaningful because it's storytelling. You know, you guys don't seem to know this is how we do it. This is how, you know, for instance, Bernie Sanders would be a perfect example. Everybody thinks he's such a left-winger here. He's actually, compared to, you know, he's pretty mainstream European when you actually look at his policies.
Yeah.
But too many Americans don't know that. So in the absence of correct information, we're very vulnerable to lies. Mm-hmm. So you never know. You know, I notice my own, sometimes I'll be up at night and I'm, because I'm up a lot in the middle of the night because I'm a writer. And that's always been my hours of writing. And I find myself either on Facebook or on Twitter having very interesting conversations. And even if it's one person who I know walked away going, yeah, I hadn't realized that. So everybody has responsibility, especially given what a cesspool social media can be. Each of us can see ourselves as purifiers to whatever extent possible.
Thank you. Alex, let me ask a follow-up and then I'll send the next one to you because of what you just said. I'm wondering, because a lot of a lot of us are wondering, we were speaking about this before we got onto the call, but how do I connect with somebody who is not of the same political party? How can I connect with somebody who I think doesn't really share the same beliefs with me? And how can we get our message across to somebody who, across the aisle?
We're not patient enough with each other. And I find a lot of times that somebody will say something pretty obnoxious. But if I respond, I mean, some people are just hateful, delete. There's no doubt about it.
Mm-hmm.
But some people make comments that really show they don't know any different.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's vigilant ignorance and you think, well, they don't know, they should know. It's amazing how much transformation can happen if you just stand there in the conversation and show people respect. You know, I remember hearing Oprah Winfrey say once, everybody just wants to feel heard.
Mm-hmm.
And I've noticed a lot of times, like I said, if it's hateful and just outright insulting, I just delete.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes you can tell there's a conversation that could be had here. And I find on the left as well as on the right, a real intolerance, a real impatience. And if we're going to be nonviolent activists, which, as I said, is the only way the transformation can happen, then we're going to have to face those defects within ourselves. If you just insult somebody, don't expect meaningful conversation. But sometimes people will say things and I realize, wow, that person really doesn't know any better.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll say something like, are you aware that blank, blank, blank? And I notice how often people are like, wow, thank you for responding to my tweet, and they become so different. Mm-hmm. We can't just speak to people who already agree with us. That's part of the corruption of American politics. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm very much a lefty, but that doesn't mean I don't recognize that there are high-minded conservative principles. Eisenhower, Republican president, but I think he was correct when he said, the American mind at its best is both liberal and conservative. There's a yin-yang there. Mm-hmm. There are high-minded conservative principles. They're not very much in view, and they're not in view at all with this president. But I grew up in a Democratic family, but Republicans were not enemies. We just didn't see things the same way. And especially after my run for president, I no longer have the illusion that everybody on the left is so pure of heart, or that everybody in the Democratic establishment is so pure of heart either. We all need to get over that.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll pass it back to Alex for the next one.
Great. So from Julian M. is what is being done in the Democratic Party to view youth not only as a demographic, but as a real political force that has the same right to be in power as older generations?
Well, first of all, power isn't granted you. Power is what you exercise. So the first thing is the millennials did not show up as perhaps they might have in the 2016 election. And also the millennials didn't show up for Bernie this time, as many people were hoping that they would. So power isn't just something that's granted to you by someone else. Power is something that you decide to exercise. Now, having said that, it is true that identity politics, including the youth vote, has become too prevalent within the strategy of the Democratic Party. Here are the Jews, here are the Muslims, here are the women, here are the Blacks, here are the youth, here are the Asians. It's fractured.
Yeah.
We're all Americans. You're Jewish and you're American. You're Muslim and you're American. You're Black and you're American. You're gay and you're American. And I think not just what the party has done, but we ourselves have done, is siloed ourselves so that then we're easy prey to those who would treat us that way. And what has happened in the Democratic establishment, obviously, particularly when it comes to real progressives, is a sidelining. There is no doubt about it. I think there's been more of a sidelining of progressives than there's been a sidelining of the youth. But it amounts at a certain point to the same thing because there's so many youth youth are progressive. And what happened in 2016 that I'm afraid is repeating itself this year is a lot of just sit down, shut up, and do as you're told. It's very dangerous. It was very dangerous and had catastrophic results in 2016. And if they're not careful, it will be just as dangerous with just as catastrophic results, God forbid, in 2020. But once again, I think it's a little harder for progressives because the fix is already in, as it were. But with youth, it has to do with voting. You can't get away from that. It has to do with voting. Does that answer that question?
I think so, yeah. Quinn, you want to ask the next one?
Sure. So this actually goes a bit on what you were already saying a bit about the progressive movement, but Annie Martineau is asking, what do you think we need to do with solidarity to place the progressive movement in the power structure? And she's wondering more, can you give us specific methods or strategies that we can use to institute or de-seat the corporate establishment?
Well, it's a complicated issue right now because first, we must not let Trump get a second term. And so there are some serious issues that, for me personally, we simply need to shelve until that's over. No one knows better than me, because I'm second only really to Bernie Sanders as a candidate who understands what they do to you if they find you inconvenient. There was an article about Marianne Williamson as the canary in the coal mine. It's really true. I spent a year in the belly of that beast, and I've seen how it works. On the other hand, this is not the time to punish the Democratic Party. We have got to make sure that Donald Trump does not have a second term. We simply must. Joe Biden is a nice man. He's got a lovely wife, lovely family. It's not about an individual. It's about how the whole establishment works. But this is not the time to have that conversation if it in any way dissuades someone from voting for the Democrat. Once the election is over, oh, we need to get busy. What that exactly will look like, I'm not sure. I think that, listen, as I said, first things first, Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony had a relationship. And Frederick Douglass at least said at the time that he was a feminist. And Susan B. Anthony said that she was an abolitionist. They both cared about the other's cause, but there was no question what had to be handled first. And that was abolition. Slavery was the greater evil. It's like if you go into an emergency room and you have 2 broken legs and 2 broken arms and a bullet near your heart. They're going to have to handle the bullet near the heart first. I see the sidelining of progressives within the Democratic Party as a very serious issue. It's 2 broken legs and 2 broken arms. However, I see Donald Trump as a bullet near the heart. So right now, let's be very disciplined. Let's make sure that we vote Democratic. Let's make sure that we don't go into this, you know what I mean. I read Hillary's book. We know that the votes for Jill Stein, we know how many people sitting it out, gave us Donald Trump. From my perspective, that must be first. Once that's done, then it's a big, big issue and a big, big question. But and believe me, I'll have a lot to say about it once that election is over. But right now, I myself want to practice the discipline and demonstrate with my own words and actions. Let's just make sure first that the Democrat wins. Once that's over, let's talk. Does that answer your question well enough?
Thank you. We appreciate, I think, having that analogy and the imagery to see what we need to go after first. Yes, thank you very much. Yeah. Alex, I'm going to pass it back to you.
We have Kathleen wondering, well, you are a political leader as well as a spiritual leader. And I think this is something that might confuse a lot of people about your platform is where is the room in with spirituality in a secular democracy today? Where do you find that?
Spirituality is simply the path of the heart. It's the path of conscience. It's a path of concern for our fellow human beings. It's the path of concern for the planet. It's a path of concern for animals. Now, let's go back, if we might, a little bit and talk about the separation of church and state. The separation of church and state is one of the most enlightened aspects of the US Constitution, and it has a double function. It means that no minister, priest, rabbi, or imam, or ayatollah, is going to walk into the Capitol building in Washington, tear up a piece of legislation, and say, you can't pass this one, you have to pass that one. That's not going to happen. There will be no religious interference with governmental functioning. It also means, and this is a big deal, there is no synagogue, church, mosque, shrine, AA meeting, or young atheist meeting. Because the freedom of religion means also not only freedom to believe however you wish to believe, but also the freedom not to believe. No policeman's going to come in to any of those meetings that I just mentioned and say, break it up. So the separation of church and state is very important. The founders never meant that to be a suppression of the religious or spiritual impulse. It meant the protection of the religious and spiritual impulse. Abolition came from the early evangelicals. The early evangelicals out of New Hampshire were the cornerstone of the abolitionist movement. Many of the women who were the head of the suffragette movement were Quakers. And obviously, the civil rights movement was led by a Baptist preacher. You have not seen one major social justice movement in the United States that did not emerge from religious circles. It is the voice of conscience. Now, as a candidate, I was very clear. I come from a minority religion myself, being a Jew. So nobody needs to tell me how important it is that in our public dialogue regarding political issues, we keep the conversation secular. But keeping the conversation secular should not mean keeping the conversation valueless. Moral values, that we are here to love one another. My belief about the American people is that we're good people. I think we're decent people. I'm not saying we're better than people in France or people in Colombia, but I think we're as good and as decent as anybody else. I think that in my country, as well as all over the world, there are far more lovers than haters. And I think that the average American tries to do right as they see right and tries to live by ethics and honor and character. I do believe that. The problem is that for the last 40 years, we have completely divorced issues like conscience, character, or ethics from public policy. And that is because our public policy and the making of public policy has been so taken over by undue financial influence, by corporate forces that themselves have become disconnected from a sense of moral and ethical responsibility to people or to planet, much less to animals. So when you say where does spirituality comes in, it means if you have 13 million hungry children in the richest country of the world, what kind of human being are you if you do not feed those children? If you have 1% of Americans controlling more wealth than the bottom 90%, if you've had such a massive transfer of wealth into the hands of a very few, that you've got tens of millions of people living with chronic economic tension and anxiety, living every single day with worry about how they're going to pay their health care, worried every single day how they're going to send their kids to college, worried every single day how they're going to get out from under these college loans. What kind of human being are you? It means that those are the spiritual questions. We're on this earth to love each other. There are universal spiritual themes that not only have to do with every religious or spiritual tradition, but even within a secular context, just having to do with being a good person. Conscience. That's the role of spirituality. And the divorce, the separation of that conversation of what is conscience, what is the right thing to do, the separation of that from public policy has led us to the brink of disaster. And when it comes to pandemics, to disaster itself.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank
We're
you.
going to take our next question from John Esteban. So, thinking about American political history, it seems to me that it's not just that we aren't taught it, but when it is taught, it's for the purpose of supporting American exceptionalism. Should a spiritual purification also imply a decentering or vigorous critique of that ideology, unless exceptionalism means to excel in death, as we are seeing now?
Right. You might be, you might not be, but you might be too young, or some of your members probably are too young to remember something that happened, because I don't remember exactly how many years ago. It had to do with the Texas textbook. Were you old enough to remember that? It had to do with Houghton Mifflin Publishers. And Houghton Mifflin Publishers does the American history textbooks. And Texas, because Texas is so big, ordered most of them. And the Texas School Board, being extremely conservative, started messing around. I think Martin Luther King got maybe one paragraph. Thomas Jefferson would no longer be known as a great thinker. I mean, it was just absolutely outrageous, and there was a lot of political infighting. I personally blame Houghton Mifflin, because this is an example of American capitalism run amok. Somebody over there must have known this was wrong, but they deferred to the Texas School Board. So unfortunately, you're absolutely right. But this is the problem we have in America today, and this is what ignorance does for you, or to you. There are forces in America who will only talk about what America's done right. Even American exceptionalism is an appropriate concept to the extent to which we recognize it only applies to the ideal. That doesn't mean one would live in the ideal, and no generation can live it for any other generation. So the concept of American exceptionalism is positive if you use it to contrast with what's happening. Some people in America only want to look at what we've done right and have no listening for what we've done wrong. They don't want to talk about slavery. They don't want to talk about genocide of Native Americans. They don't want to talk about the Vietnam War. They don't want to talk about the military-industrial complex. They don't want to talk about what the inequality, only what we've done right. But I think there is an equally unbalanced trend in America as well. And that's many people who today only want to talk about what we've done wrong and have no listening for what we've done right. And they seem to have just discovered the violent history of America, for instance, or the lack of conscience in modern American capitalism. And their view at times is just as inaccurate. The truth of the matter is we're people. If you go to therapy or you go to a spiritual support group, what is going to be very evident to you and everyone else is you've done some things right and you've done some things wrong. We did have slavery in this country, but we also had abolition. We did have the institutionalized suppression of women, but we also had the women's suffrage movement. We did have institutionalized white supremacy in the American South, but we also had the civil rights movement. So I think that you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, your questioner is absolutely right about how American history is taught, but I think some of the knee-jerk reaction overcompensates in the way you hear some people talk, we've never done anything right, which is just as incorrect. I think we have to love our country enough and love the ideals enough to be strong enough to be brutally self-aware about how off track we have been. The point is, in the historical trend in our country, when we have been off track, is that a generation has risen up to put it back on track. And that's our task. Our generation is faced with a terrible, I'm not in any way minimizing it, a terrible accumulated factors that represent a profound challenge to our democracy. But so have other generations. So have others. Let's just not be the first generation to wimp out on the task of doing what it takes to get our country back on track.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more, Alex.
Yeah. So Anne wants to know, if you were offered your ideal role within the Biden administration, what would you choose to do?
Well, I would do anything that they asked me to aid his election, that's for sure. I'm not kidding myself. I think that my endorsement of Bernie and my sort of calling the system on what it is, in too many cases, I can't even imagine I don't see that happening. But I am a patriotic American, and I hope to see, I think both political parties have lost their soul. And I grew up in a home where, my father was very much an FDR Democrat. And I would like to think that I could be useful in helping the Democratic Party restore its soul. I would be very surprised if if there was an invitation from the Biden administration, but I don't want to sound cynical about that either.
Thank you. Thank you, Marianne. I've really appreciated the uplifting tone in all of your answers. And I think from a lot of the questions or the comments we've gotten, it's been similar. We feel like we have a place to move forward. So in the last minutes that we have, are there any, before I say that too, somebody's asking if this will be replayed. Yes, because there's so many more people who want to join who couldn't, so we will be replaying this after. But last for you, Marianne, what message do you want to leave us all with?
Well, I hope if people are interested, I hope they will go to my own social media platforms, my Instagram, my Twitter at Mar Williamson, my public Facebook page, my website, marianne.com or marianne2020.com. I do feel I got an inside view. I was in the belly of the beast for a year. And it made me not more cynical. I feel in a way the system is even more corrupt than I feared. But I am even more romantic about American democracy than I ever was. Thomas Jefferson said that the only safe repository for power in the United States is in the hands of the people. And I know you mentioned you come from Iowa. Part of the sadness that I feel about the whole process is that I felt that the people of Iowa, the people of New Hampshire, the people of South Carolina and Nevada, but particularly of making very serious, well-considered decisions. And the primary system, if allowed to really play itself out, is a wise one. I was very disappointed by the machinations of the DNC. The DNC should be there to facilitate democracy, not to in any way manipulate it or dictate it. Once again, I'm very clear. That does not mean I'm not voting for Joe Biden. The Democrat must win. But it is interesting to me that if you compare the view of the Republicans to the RNC and the view of the Democrats to the DNC, the Republicans look at the RNC like, they're our administrative arm. They work for us. They run our office. Whereas among Democrats, there's this very odd difference. What does the DNC say? What does the DNC say? The DNC is not a governmental authority of any kind. This is extremely important to remember. And after the 2016 election, when some Bernie supporters sued them, their case in court was based on the fact they said, we didn't owe anybody a fair election. So if the Democratic Party is to retain its soul, to reclaim its soul, we are going to have to break this codependent relationship with what amounts to a bunch of guys sitting in a back room with cigars, choosing candidates. It's not healthy, it's not good. But I want to say that within the context of being very clear, Joe Biden 2020, the Democrats must win. The Democrats must win the Senate. I, by the way, hope that you will look. We all know the second most important race is Mitch McConnell. The DNC has put their money behind of course, the corporatist Democratic candidate who is Amy McGrath. I hope all of you will look into Mike Broyhier. Amy is a Marine. I admire her. Mike Broyhier is also a Marine, but he's also a farmer. Most of the $16 million that Amy has raised is outside Kentucky. Mike Broyhier has much more of a connection with the farmers of Kentucky, and that's how McConnell keeps winning. Louisville the Democrats get. Lexington, the Democrats get. McConnell keeps winning because of all of his popularity among the rural areas. So I hope that those of you who are interested, and I think we're all interested in the Mitch McConnell win, I hope you will look at that progressive, at the progressive candidate, Mike Boyhire. This sort of takeover of the Democratic Party by the corporatist elements within, for real progressives, this is a problem. We need to just win whoever the Democratic candidates are. However, as I said, as in the case of Mike Boyhire, those primaries are not done yet in those congressional and those senatorial wins. So let's do what we can. Let's duke it out in a positive way with these primaries, and then in November, vote blue, vote blue, vote blue. And I'll be honored if you have me back on the other side of that, because that's when we'll really have a lot to talk about.
Looking forward to that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Well,
thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It was lovely being with you. Thank you so much.
Really taking the time to answer all these questions. For, you know,
guys take care of yourself. Alex, it'll be good to see you back in the United States.
Yes.
Win do great things in Colombia.
Soon enough. Yeah.
Much love, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you. Yeah. And many thanks to everyone who joined the call. We appreciated your input and look forward to seeing you on future calls. As a reminder, please request your ballot from votefromabroad.org. This will be an excellent way to vote out the problematic politicians that are keeping us from properly addressing our systemic issues, as she's pointed out.
Mm-hmm.
Quinn, do you have anything?
Great. And
yeah.
Sure. I just want to add that your support really goes a long way. So please visit democratsabroad.org/donate to contribute to events like this so that we can continue to host them. And we are also always looking for volunteers. Contact your local Democrats Abroad, or again, go to democratsabroad.org/volunteer to get involved. There's plenty of ways you can get involved with phone banking, with registration drives, and other ways locally. So that's it. With that, we're going to be ending our call. Thank you again to Marianne, who had to hop off already. And thank you for joining us with the Youth Caucus Global. Youth Caucus Global, and we hope to see you on a future call.
Also, just want to point out that we had a lot of questions, and we're really sorry that we didn't have enough time to address all of them. But we hope that you enjoyed the call, nevertheless. And end the meeting now.